Greetings, class. This lecture is on Chapter 30, Section 6, which is on the end of World War II. And the main idea is that Allied victories in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific led to the end of this terrible conflict. Some events took place that really kind of turned the tide of the war. So we'll see several major offensives led by the Allied powers that really start to push back against the Axis powers and really turn the tide of this conflict. Probably the most significant of these major offensive and these turning points would be the Battle of Stalingrad. So it was really more of a siege and not so much a battle. It was a 6-month siege in the city of Stalingrad, which is a Russian city located right here on our map. You see the mouses. And it began in the summer of 1942 and it ends in the winter of 1943. And it's just this bloody, brutal, street-by-street war zone combat where German soldiers and Russian soldiers and civilians are fighting each other day and night. And you're essentially fighting to take control of a factory or to take control of like a street. And like one day you would take it over and then the next day you'd be chased away. And it was just this long, bloody conflict, which was great for the Soviets, militarily speaking, strategy-wise, but bad for the Germans because the Soviets could outlast and wait as long as they wanted to for this fight to end. But the Germans had to win this battle quite quickly because they're fighting in the middle of the Soviet Union and they are lacking resources, clothing, and ammunition. And if they didn't win decisively and quickly, they would run out of resources and be defeated. And that's basically what happens. After fighting for 6 months, the Russians are able to defeat the Germans, and the Battle of Stalingrad will be a huge victory for the Allied powers and a major turning point in the war. Because after this point, the Germans will no longer be invading and expanding into new territories. They'll be retreating and trying to prevent themselves from getting conquered by their enemies. So on this map here, we can see where Stalingrad is. Pretty much after this battle, Germany will be in a massive retreat from the Soviet Union all the way back into Berlin as they're being chased down by the Russians. Now, while this is taking place in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, in North Africa, Germany is also being attacked by a coalition of U.S. and British forces, led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's the general is in charge of the U.S. forces in North Africa and will eventually be the overall commander of the Allied powers in Europe. There will be a massive assault, an offensive against Erwin Rommel and the German tank groups in Northern Africa. And so because of Eisenhower's tactics and the actions of a British leader named Bernard Montgomery, Rommel will be pushed out of North Africa. And by 1942, by the time the year's over, Germany will be no longer in North Africa. And it'll be a place where the Allied powers can launch further attacks into Europe. So after the Battle of Stalingrad and after Germany had been chased out of Northern Africa, the new debate became about where do you launch your invasion into Europe? Currently, you have the Soviet Union marching from the east into Germany, but Stalin and the Soviet Union are going to demand that a second front gets created because at this point, it was pretty much most of the German army fighting against the Soviet Union. So you have a lot of Soviets dying, but not very many other Allied powers. And if you could invade Europe, invade German-controlled land from another spot, you would force Germany to split its army in half. And that way the Russians would only be fighting against half the German army instead of the whole army. And the debate was, where do you launch this second front? Russia wanted the United States and Britain to invade northern France, but the United States and Britain didn't want to do that because that was the most heavily fortified area. So while it'd be a critical blow to Germany if they were invaded at that spot, it'd probably lead to a lot of casualties. So instead, Britain and the United States decided to invade Italy and Ethiopia and Sicily from the south. And so this is called the soft underbelly of the Axis power because the United States and Britain believed that Italy would be an easier target to invade and conquer than northern France. And they ended up proving right to an extent. Once the Allied powers invaded Italy and Sicily, pretty quickly Mussolini is forced to resign, and there's a lot of instability within the Italian government. Mussolini will be executed, and his political party, the fascists, will dissolve. The people that were in charge that kind of caused Italy to join up with the Axis powers. So when this invasion happens, Italy really just drops out of the war. They're kind of done fighting, and they end up declaring war against their former ally, Germany. And so this would all seem like a lot of serious victories, but As the Allied powers continued to kind of march up the Italian boot into Central Europe, German soldiers came down into Italy, and they were able to really slow down this second front, and it kind of got gummed down. And so this soft underbelly, they often say, turns into one tough gut, where the Allied powers kind of got stuck fighting in the mountains of southern Italy, even though Italy had dropped out of the war. While this second offensive is taking place in Italy, there's all kinds of fighting taking place in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. In the Atlantic Ocean, you have a bunch of American vessels that are trying to transport resources and goods to the Allied countries fighting in Europe. But German submarines or U-boats are causing all kinds of havoc, and they're sinking these merchant vessels. During World War II, the German submarines would travel what are called wolf packs, which is just these big groups of submarines. And it was very hard to try and destroy or break up these wolf packs. So the Allies had to find new methods of trying to escort these resources across the Atlantic into Europe. Two things that they did. One is they started escorting merchant ships, ships that are bringing goods, with lots of destroyers. So these big battleships that could, in theory, take on these submarines. And they'd also use airplanes that would fly off and kind of scout the seas and try and see if they could capture or see any German U-boats that were, breaching the water or close to the surface. And that way they could warn the merchant ships to go a different direction. But without a doubt, the most effective tool used for helping these merchant boats travel across the Atlantic was the invention of sonar, which you could basically use to kind of figure out where a submarine was. And so really it ruined the greatest advantage that submarines had of, not knowing where they were located. Now you knew where they were because of sonar, you could just sail a different direction. So that's going to lead to some victory and more resources coming from the United States over to Europe to help the Allied powers. Over in the Pacific, the United States is going to begin trying to take back all the land that Japan had conquered after Pearl Harbor. And the big battle that's like the decisive turning point in the Pacific theater, this area of conflict between the Japanese and the United States, is the Battle of Midway. Midway is a collection of islands, and at Midway was a bunch of U.S. aircraft carriers. That's a picture of one at the top of the slide here. These are boats that would be used to transport airplanes, and you could also have airplanes take off from these boats. They're kind of like moving islands. And so if you wanted to have like an offensive invasion or you wanted to launch an attack against somebody, you really needed these aircraft carriers so you could move your airplanes and they'd be allowed to fly, take off, and bomb wherever you wanted to attack. If you don't have any aircraft carriers, you're kind of a sitting duck and forced to fight a defensive war. And at Midway, the United States had a bunch of their aircraft carriers, and the Japanese tried to come and launch an attack that would destroy these aircraft carriers. But the United States found out about this. Secret codes were captured that told of this Japanese attack. And so the United States launched basically a trap for these Japanese, invader attackers. And instead of the U.S. losing their aircraft carriers, the Japanese actually had most of their aircraft carriers destroyed. They walked right into the trap. And as a result, Japan would no longer be able to conquer or attack any other islands. And they had to sort of sit in and start preparing for a defensive war. And so the Japanese Army and Navy began entrenching themselves in their islands and making these tunnel systems and building gun turrets so that when the United States came to conquer and take them back, it would be this brutal fighting and hard to kind of kick them out. To fight against this, because it'd be horrific if the United States had to start here at Pearl Harbor on this map and take back all of this land where every place was filled with entrenched Japanese soldiers, the U.S. instituted a policy called island hopping. Island hopping is a policy of capturing only certain Japanese islands that had strategic value and then ignoring the non-essential islands as you advance closer and closer towards Japan. So instead of taking back everything, you just conquer the islands that you need. So the United States starts here, they travel down here, they take back these islands, they fly over and skip all those islands, and then they take this island, and they kind of just pick the ones they need. That way they reduce the number of casualties that they're going to have, and they make a faster journey to Japan. This was a hyper-effective strategy, and it ended up, saving a lot of American lives and got the U.S. closer to Japan, where eventually they'd be able to bomb the Japanese islands. So in Europe, the southern invasion of Italy had kind of gummed up, and they needed to launch another second front. They needed to launch another place where they could attack Germany from and split their forces because Italy wasn't working. And so finally, they decided to now invade northwestern France, which had been what Stalin had wanted initially. And this massive invasion by the Allied powers into northwestern France is called Operation Overlord. And it's going to eventually create a more effective second front where the Allied powers will be more able to fight Germany on two different battlefronts. The day when this invasion takes place is called D-Day. It happens on June 6, 1944. And it's this massive amphibious assault where a bunch of planes fly over first and a bunch of paratroopers come down behind enemy German lines. But then a bunch of boats carrying American, British, Canadian, Australian soldiers sail to these beaches of Normandy where there's a bunch of cliffs. You can see in the picture below. And you hop off this boat and then you basically have to like run to these cliffs and climb these cliffs. And at the top of these cliffs were all these German soldiers that were camped out and were just shooting down at these Allied invaders. And it is this really bloody battle. It's often considered like the finest hour of American military history. And after all this treacherous fighting, the Allied powers were able to actually conquer these beaches in Normandy, and D-Day was successful. We were able to create a second front. And at this point, it's going to be a march from northern France all the way to Berlin in Germany. And it kind of seems like the war is going to inevitably come to an end. There's still a lot of fighting to take place, but the writing's kind of on the wall that this conflict's going to end with Allied victory. The last chance that Germany had of trying to stop this kind of inevitable defeat was in the Ardennes forest at this thing called the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was a costly 10-day battle that became, or that was Germany's last major counteroffensive. And they basically took all their soldiers that they had and they just put them into one giant group and they formed this big bulge and they attacked the American and British lines of armies. And they had this huge fight that really slowed down the Allied invasion into Berlin. But eventually, after 10 days, the Allied powers were victorious. They broke through this bulge and they were able to continue marching towards Berlin. And so after the Battle of the Bulge, it was really just a matter of time until the war was going to end and Germany would be knocked out. Which brings us then to 1945. And at this point, Germany has the Russians coming from their east. So Stalin and his forces are invading from the east, and Britain and the United States are invading from the west. And it's kind of a race to see who can get to Berlin first, the Russians or the Americans. And when both armies are really close to Berlin, Hitler actually, instead of surrendering, commits suicide because he's terrified of what these countries would do to him since all the terrible things that he did. And so he commits suicide, and then the other German high commanders surrender. And this all takes place on May 8th, 1945. And this is known as VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe. So the fighting is now over in Europe. And they'll have to kind of pick up the pieces afterwards from there. But even though Germany had surrendered, Japan was still fighting in this conflict. And Japan is really kind of fighting to the very last soldier. As the United States gets closer and closer and closer to the Japanese mainland and are going to be able to start bombing the Japanese islands, the Japanese soldiers become more desperate. And so they start using a tactic called kamikaze, which would be these Japanese fighter pilots who would fly suicide missions, and they would just crash their planes in the American boats and the American destroyers and aircraft carriers. So it really sort of showed the full extent to like how far the Japanese soldiers were willing to go to defend their country. Even though it was pretty clear they were going to lose, they were willing to give their lives, like with this kamikaze strategy, just to, try and fight to the bitter end. And so the U.S. is continuing to fight in the Pacific theater, and they keep getting closer and closer to Japan, but the fighting is getting awfully brutal with a lot of casualties. While this fighting is taking place, the leaders of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States are going to meet at several war conferences. The first takes place at Yalta, which is an area in the Crimean, so like the Ukraine. And then there'll be another meeting at Potsdam, which is in Germany. And these leaders, or these meetings, have the three big leaders from the different countries. So Churchill, Stalin, and then FDR, and then Truman later, the president replaces FDR. And at these meetings, they agree to several things. One, they agree that they're going to divide Germany into 4 occupied regions. Now that Germany's been defeated instead of just harshly punishing Germany like they did after World War One, they're going to divide into 4 pieces, and each country will kind of rule and govern over each piece and rebuild Germany so that it doesn't become another military dictatorship. And then they also agree that the Soviet Union would eventually enter the war against Japan and help the United States defeat Japan, since Japan's fighting to the very bitter end. Which then brings us to the last part here, Japanese surrender. So in August, all this fighting against Japan really kind of comes to a head. August 6, 1945, the United States uses one of 2 atomic bombs that they have created as part of the Manhattan Project, this really expensive and huge research project to build atomic weapons. And they're going to drop one of these atomic bombs on Hiroshima. And it's going to be heavy casualties. And the world is kind of shocked because outside of a few people that are part of this project, really nobody knew these bombs even existed that could destroy an entire city. The United States is then going to give Japan a couple of days to decide if they are going to surrender, or else they'll drop another atomic bomb. And in between this first bomb being dropped and the second bomb being dropped, the Soviet Union begins to invade Manchuria, which is territory under the control of Japan. And then the next day, August 9th, the United States drops their second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, which destroys that city. And so all this carnage really shows Japan that this war is, terrible and it's out of control and they can't win. And on August 14th, Japan surrenders unconditionally. And that day is known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan. And World War II is now over, at least the fighting is over. And the human cost of this war was horrific. 22 million military personnel are going to die as a result of this war, which is a staggering number. That alone is higher than the number of people that died in World War I. You have 34 million people that are wounded, and over 16 million civilians are going to be killed. So a shocking number of civilians, those that aren't even fighting, are going to be killed in this war. And you also have a ton of unprecedented human rights violations. The Holocaust will take place, which we'll look at more later. And you'll see things like the Bataan Death March, which is where Japanese soldiers forced 78,000 prisoners of war from the United States and the Philippines to march 55 miles to a prisoner of war camp, which led to the death of 10,000 people. And so this war had really showed a lot of atrocities that had never before been seen. And the question now is, what do you do? How do you punish these sort of crimes? And how do you rebuild the world after all this awful events have taken place?